Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Karl Marx's Kapital, Volume 1, Chapter 18, Various Formulae for the Rate of Surplus Value. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So Chapter 18 is the third and final chapter in Part 5 of 8 of Kapital, and it's pretty short, with Marx in this chapter exploring the rate of surplus value through a bunch of different equivalent formulas that look at this phenomenon from different angles. Because there are a lot of different formulas presented, and because this chapter is so short, I will also be putting screenshots of the text on the screen. And as usual, if you want to read along with any of this, go to the Marxists.org version of Kapital. I'm using their HTML version. Let's begin. We've seen that the rate of surplus value is represented by the following formulas. And here there are three formulas which are presented as equivalents or synonyms, and Marx has labeled this group with Roman numeral 1. Moving from left to right, we see surplus value over variable capital, also known as lowercase s over lowercase v, equals surplus value over value of labor power, equals surplus labor over necessary labor. The two first of these formulas represent, as a ratio of values, that which in the third is represented as a ratio of the times during which those values are produced. These formulas, supplementary the one to the other, are rigorously definite and correct. We therefore find them substantially but not consciously worked out in classical political economy. There we meet with the following derivative formulas. And here we have another group of three, which is labeled Roman numeral 2. Surplus labor over working day equals surplus value over value of the product equals surplus product over total product. One and the same ratio is here expressed as a ratio of labor times, of the values in which those labor times are embodied, and of the products in which those values exist. It is of course understood that by value of the product is meant only the value newly created in a working day, the constant part of the value of the product being excluded. In all of these formulas of Group 2, the actual degree of exploitation of labor, or the rate of surplus value, is falsely expressed. Let the working day be 12 hours. Then, making the same assumptions as in former instances, the real degree of exploitation of labor will be represented in the following proportions. 6 hours of surplus labor over 6 hours of necessary labor equals surplus value of 3 shillings over variable capital of 3 shillings equals 100%, meaning that each of those ratios, 6 hours to 6 hours or 3 shillings to 3 shillings, equals 100%. From the Group 2 formulas, we get very differently. 6 hours of surplus labor over a working day of 12 hours equals a surplus value of 3 shillings over value created of 6 shillings, or 50%. 6 hours to 12 hours, 3 shillings to 6 shillings. These derivative formulas express in reality only the proportion in which the working day, or the value produced by it, is divided between capitalist and laborer. If they are to be treated as direct expressions of the degree of self-expansion of capital, the following erroneous law would hold good. Surplus labor or surplus value can never reach 100%. And a footnote here. Thus, for example, in the third letter to V. Kirchmann von Rodbertus, Refutation of Ricardo's Doctrine of Ground Rent and Justification of a New Theory of Rent, Berlin, 1851, I shall return to this letter later on. In spite of its erroneous theory of rent, it sees through the nature of capitalist production. And a note added in the third German edition, it may be seen from this how favorably Marx judged his predecessors whenever he found in them real progress or new and sound ideas. The subsequent publication of Rodbertus's letters to Rudolf Meyer has shown that the above acknowledgement by Marx wants restricting to some extent. In those letters, this passage occurs. Quote, "Capital must be rescued not only from labor but from itself, and that will be best effected by treating the acts of the industrial capitalist as economic and political functions that have been delegated to him with his capital, and by treating his profit as a form of salary, because we still know no other social organization. But salaries may be regulated, and may also be reduced if they take too much from wages. The irruption of Marx into society, as I may call his book, must be warded off. Altogether, Marx's book is not so much an investigation into capital as a polemic against the present form of capital, a form which he confounds with the concept itself of capital." Unquote. That's from 1881. And Engels concludes in this note, to such ideological commonplaces did the bold attack by Rodbertus in his, quote, social letters finally dwindle down. Back to the main text. Since the surplus labor is only an aliquot part of the working day, or since surplus value is only an aliquot part of the value created, the surplus labor must necessarily be always less than the working day, or the surplus value always less than the total value created. In order, however, to attain the ratio of 100 to 100, they must be equal. In order that the surplus labor may absorb the whole day, i.e. an average day of any week or year, the necessary labor must sink to zero. But if the necessary labor vanish, so too does the surplus labor, since it is only a function of the former. The ratio, surplus labor over working day, or surplus labor as compared to the working day, or surplus value over value created, can therefore never reach the limit 100 over 100, still less rise to 100 plus x over 100. But not so the rate of surplus value, the real degree of exploitation of labor. Take, for example, the estimate of L. de Laverne, according to which the English agricultural laborer only gets 1/4, the capitalist farmer, on the other hand, 3/4 of the product, or its value, apart from the question of how the booty is subsequently divided between the capitalist, the landlord, and others. And a footnote here, that part of the product which merely replaces the constant capital advanced is of course left out in this calculation. Mr. L. de Laverne, a blind admirer of England, is inclined to estimate the share of the capitalist too low rather than too high. Back to the main text. According to this surplus labor of the English agricultural laborer is to his necessary labor as 3 to 1, which gives a rate of exploitation of 300%. The favorite method of treating the working day as constant in magnitude became, through the use of the Group 2 formulas, a fixed usage, because in them surplus labor is always compared with a working day of given length. The same holds good when the repartition of the value produced is exclusively kept in sight. The working day that has already been realized in given value must necessarily be a day of given length. The habit of representing surplus value and value of labor power as fractions of the value created, a habit that originates in the capitalist mode of production itself and whose import will hereafter be disclosed, conceals the very transaction that characterizes capital, namely the exchange of variable capital for living labor power, and the consequent exclusion of the laborer from the product. Instead of the real fact, we have false semblance of an association, in which laborer and capitalist divide the product in proportion to the different elements which they respectively contribute toward its formation. Footnote: all well-developed forms of capitalist production being forms of cooperation, nothing is of course easier than to make abstraction from their antagonistic character, and to transform them by a word into some form of free association, as is done by A. de la Borde in On the Spirit of Association in All the Interests of the Community, Paris, 1818. H. Carey, the Yankee, occasionally performs this conjuring trick with like success, even with the relations resulting from slavery. Back to the main text. Moreover, the Group 2 formulas can at any time be reconverted into Group 1 if, for instance, we have surplus labor of 6 hours over a working day of 12 hours. Then the necessary labor time, being 12 hours less or minus the surplus labor of 6 hours, we get the following result. Surplus labor of 6 hours over necessary labor of 6 hours equals 100 over 100. There is a third formula which I have occasionally already anticipated. It is Group 3, surplus value over value of labor power equals surplus labor over necessary labor equals unpaid labor over paid labor. After the investigations we have given above, it is no longer possible to be misled by the formula unpaid labor over paid labor into concluding that the capitalist pays for labor and not for labor power. This formula is only a popular expression for surplus labor, which is unpaid labor, over necessary labor, which is paid labor. The capitalist pays the value, so far as price coincides with value, of the labor power, and receives in exchange the disposal of the living labor power itself. His usufruct, or the right to use someone else's property without destroying it and to keep the profits resulting from that use, is spread over 2 periods. During one, the laborer produces a value that is only equal to the value of their labor power. They produce its equivalent. This the capitalist receives in return for their advance of the price of the labor power, a product ready-made in the market. During the other period, the period of surplus labor, the usufruct of the labor power creates a value for the capitalist that costs them no equivalent. Comment, in other words, it is free. And a footnote here, although the physiocrats could not penetrate the mystery of surplus value, yet this much was clear to them, viz. That it is, quote, a wealth which is independent and disposable, which he has not bought and which he sells. Back to the main text. This expenditure, the surplus labor, of labor power comes to the capitalist gratis. In this sense it is that surplus labor can be called unpaid labor. Capital, therefore, is not only, as Adam Smith says, the command over labor. It is essentially the command over unpaid labor. All surplus value, whatever particular form, profit, interest, or rent it may subsequently crystallize into, is in substance the materialization of unpaid labor. The secret of the self-expansion of capital resolves itself into having the disposal of a definite quantity of other people's unpaid labor. And that is the end of Chapter 18 and of Part 5 of 8 of Kapital. And that last quote about having other people's unpaid labor reminds me of the saying that capitalists and their defenders will use online about socialism being great except when you run out of other people's money. Capitalism literally is making people work for free in order to enrich an already wealthy capitalist parasite class. So the whole thing about other people's money, where did you get it from in the first place? Anyway, what do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation is encouraging, they're also materially helpful, and they allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without them, particularly as we don't run ads on our content. So if you like this channel, learn something from it, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. It really does make a difference. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's just for the algorithm. And remember, we can agitate and educate online, but the third part, organizing, happens in real life. So take what you've learned here into your local left and into the organizations that are fighting the class struggle in your area. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.